Hi folks. In this session we are going to take a little bit of a different approach. We are still talking about the period of early industrial capitalism in the middle decades of the 19th century. We're still talking about the urban system, but instead of describing it with maps and talking about the general processes, I want to introduce you to a very particular way of thinking about questions that we're going to come back to several more times during the course. And some of you may have not experienced this approach in the past, but we're going to use mathematical and geometric models to help us understand aspects of what exists in the real world and what might exist in the future. Now, a word about modeling and how it relates to the concepts that we're talking about. So this approach of modeling derives from a particular approach to knowledge. If you're into these kinds of things, it's called logical positivism. It's often practiced within the field of neoclassical economics, although it is practiced in other disciplines as well. And the idea here is that if we can really focus in on the core drivers, the core processes that really determine what we see in reality, then we can better understand the system. In order to do that, in order to really focus in on the core drivers, what we can do is we can set up a model where we smooth out the irregularities. We assume away some of the stuff that in the real world messes everything up, so that we can really focus our attention on the one central process and figure out how it works. Okay? So the point of these models is not to describe everything that we would understand or see when we look at reality. Instead, the point of models is to help us understand the core process that gives rise to what we can see. Not the details, but the core process. And so what we're going to do in this particular model, it's called central place theory, is that we're going to look at a couple of core processes and ask the question, can these core processes explain basic things that we observe about urban systems? Specifically, we're going to see if we can understand urban system development and structure. We're going to ask a couple of basic questions, but in general, the question that we're going to ask with central place theory is, how do urban systems develop under capitalism? Now, it's not all urban systems, and it's not all forms of capitalism. We're going to focus in particular on the spatial structure of the system of cities, the collections of cities, when cities serve a commercial role, meaning that they provide goods and services to a surrounding population. In particular, we're going to focus central place theory on questions about the size and the spacing of urban places in a largely agrarian setting. So the idea is that you've got a countryside where there's a bunch of farmers, and they have to go into towns or into cities to buy things and to consume services. This model, central place theory, fits best in contexts where you have that kind of arrangement, a largely agrarian population that goes into cities to buy things and to consume basic services. This period of U.S. history in the middle of the 19th century, as the frontier of European settlement is pushing westward, provides a really good place to explore this set of ideas. So we're going to focus roughly on the Midwest and the Great Plains. Some of the graphs that I show you are from Iowa, for example, which is pretty flat. And we're going to ask basic questions and see if the model, central place theory, helps us understand what's going on there. what's interesting is that the theory itself, central place theory, was developed in the 1930s in Germany by a scholar named Walter Christaller. All right, so all of that's on the first slide. Now we're going to the second slide, which is the same population of European settlement on the North American continent in the U.S. as of 1870 that we've seen in previous sessions. So the green color shading represents where Europeans had settled by 1830, and the purple represents areas that Europeans had settled by 1870. We're going to focus our attention in on the Great Plains portion, in particular on Iowa, which is now inside of the red circle in the middle of the image. I said that central place theory as a model tries to come up with an explanation for some basic observations using the framework of the model itself. What are those observations? Well, first, in terms of the number and the spacing of urban places, when we look at the largest urban places, the cities, they in general are few in number. They are about as far apart from one another as they can be, and they offer very specialized and typically expensive goods and services. In contrast, when we look at small urban places, hamlets or villages, they are much more frequent, they are greater in number, they are close together, and they offer very basic, common kinds of goods and services that are not terribly expensive. So those are the basic observations. Now, can the model itself help us to explain those observations? We start with assumptions. As I mentioned earlier, we need to assume away all of the other stuff in reality that might influence those observations. We're going to add some of this stuff back in after we understand the model, so it's not going away completely. But we do this exercise of assuming away all of the confounds, the stuff that gets in the way of the one process or the couple of processes that we want to focus our attention on. So our first assumption is that the land surface, what is called the plane, the P-L-A-N-E, not the airplane, but the surface is flat and it's featureless. There is no outstanding topography, there are no large rivers or natural barriers, that it's basically just a flat plain. Iowa's pretty close to that, and other portions of the Great Plains and some of the western portions of the Midwest are pretty flat and pretty uninspiring if you're looking for topographic inspiration. At first, we're not going to allow transportation infrastructure. In other words, farmers get in their wagon and they drive across the countryside being pulled by oxen or by horses to get to town. There's no roads, there are no railroads, there's no transportation infrastructure that will channel movement. Everybody is going from point to point directly across the surface. Nothing then will affect transportation cost except for distance. How far you drive will determine the cost of transportation. Now the cost can be in terms of how much grain that it takes to feed your animals, or it could be in terms of your time. Second assumption, all of the people in this model are economically rational. We call the people economic agents. There are two categories of people that are at play in this model. One, consumers, the farmers out in the countryside. Their goal is to maximize their economic utility by minimizing their cost. They want to spend as little as possible, either in direct cash or in terms of indirect costs that they might be subject to. In this landscape, transportation costs are the primary component of what consumers spend. We are not allowing for retailers to differentiate their product based on quality. Everybody is basically offering the same quality of goods. The only thing that is affecting decision making on the part of the consumer is distance because distance is the primary determiner of transportation cost. Thus, as a result, consumers will always choose in this model to shop at the closest urban center. In other words, they're always going to the closest place in order to purchase their supplies and to consume whatever services they might need to. So consumers minimize cost. They do so rationally with a full awareness of everything that is going on. The second group of economic agents are retailers, those who sell things and goods and services. Their goal is to maximize profit. They want to make money. This is a capitalist system where retailers are motivated by the profit incentive. They want to make as much profit as possible. They're economically rational. They have full information within this system is that they maximize the space, the area that they have complete control over, their trade areas. So let's look at how these assumptions play out when we look at the system. One of the things that we see is that there is an association, a basic association, we've already hinted at this, between the nature of the goods and services that are available in a place and the nature of the place itself. This grid has this, it's a 4x4 matrix, and it shows you that the columns in this matrix are arrayed from small places to large places. The sequence goes village, town, city, and regional city, with regional city being the largest city. It's the far right column. The rows in this matrix are the kinds of goods and services that are available in these particular places. Order simply means how specialized, how expensive is it relative to where you are. So low order goods are things like bread, or in this context, probably even more basic things like grain from which you could make bread. High order goods and services are things like, today you would say, advanced medical procedures would be a very high order service that you would have to travel to a large city in order to consume, to purchase, whereas you can go to a health clinic even in pretty small towns. In terms of cars, there is an ordering of goods and services. In Athens, when I first moved here, there was no Mercedes dealership. You had to go to Atlanta if you wanted to purchase a Mercedes. Today, Athens has a Mercedes dealership, but it was lacking that higher order good for much of its history. So what you see in this matrix is that the largest places offer bread and milk. They have low order goods, and they offer the full array of goods all the way up this hierarchy until you get to the highest position. So they offer these very specialized and expensive goods as well. When you look at the smaller places, the village, then you see that the only thing they have available in them are these very basic commodities and services. You're not going to find a neurosurgeon who is operating within a village. So this plays out spatially, as you might expect. So here is a map of western Iowa. The data that were used to produce these maps is pretty old, but it illustrates the point. Even this was, I think, the 1970s, maybe the 1960s when the data were collected. But it's asking, where do you go to consume these different kinds of services? So for groceries, folks out in Iowa, not living in the city, but living out in the countryside, typically go to a relatively local place, right? So there are many opportunities to purchase grocery shopping, and people tend to travel fairly short distances. When we look at lawyers, there are fewer centers where people can go to see a lawyer, fewer places on the landscape. They are farther apart, and people then will travel a longer distance to consume that service. Hospitals, in the lower diagram on this page, there's only 4 places where there is a hospital in western Iowa at this particular time, southwest Iowa. And people will travel a pretty long distance in order to consume that service. So this is the basic consumer behavior data that drives this model. This ends the first part of our session on central place theory. The second part will consider the development of hexagonal trade areas and layers of hexagonal trade areas. And the third part will look at the stacking of those layers to create more complicated urban system landscapes.